Hello, and thanks for tuning into Ukraine Update from Compass Media. I'm your host, Finbar Markey. Every week I'm joined by JOHN Moran, former head of the foreign desk in the Irish press, to look at what's happening in the war in Ukraine, but also look at some wider international news as well that is connected to that. John's going to give us a 5 to 10 minute opening narrative on developments in the Ukraine war over the last week. And from there, we'll discuss that in more detail and look at a few other topics as well. Thanks for joining us again, John.
Thanks, Finbar.
What have you got for us this week?
Well, this week I have a major assault in Backmode, which is very interesting. Wagner and Russian forces have made massive gains in and around Bakhmut, smashing their way into 3 new districts, leaving the Ukrainian defenders with barely 10% of the city in the ever-diminishing western section. Fighting is now taking place in the center, the north, and the west of Bakhmut city, as the Ukrainian garrison fights for every room and every building as they doggedly defend, while attempting to retreat to the better defended section in the east of the city. It now seems only a matter of hours or perhaps days before the fall of this city, which is hugely symbolic to both the Russians and the Ukrainians. In recent attacks, Russia has employed increased air support to attack targets on the ground using very heavy munitions containing 500 to 1,500 kilograms of explosives. This is happening because of the attrition on Ukraine's air defenses in numerous attacks all over Ukraine over the past months. A number of military commentators have said the use of these weapons could now be a, quote, game changer, unquote. Heavy clashes have also been reported in Zaporizhia and Kherson provinces in the southern front. Russian military report that a large recce in combat was carried out by Ukrainian forces into Zaporizhia. Recces in combat can sometimes be mistaken for an actual offensive, and right now Russians are jittery as they await the launch of the much heralded Ukrainian spring offensive. Because of the size of the attack, there was some alarm that this might be the long promised spring offensive by the Ukrainians. However, the reconnaissance groups was repulsed by the defending Russian army forces with heavy losses on the retreating Ukrainians. Heavy shelling is also reported in Kherson province. Russian forces have evacuated the civilian population further east out of danger should any offensive take place. Very heavy fighting is also reported from Ugledar, Avdiivka, and Kupiansk. In Ugledar, heavy fighting is also reported with little ground gained by either side in this endless slugfest. Fierce fighting is also reported from Kremania, where Russian forces are attempting to clear out a large forested area. Twitter CEO Elon Musk has revealed in an interview that governments around the world have had full access to Twitter and even still do. In an excerpt from his Fox News interview with host Tucker Carlson, Musk told Carlson he was shocked to find out about the government's ability to read users' direct messages on his platform. Quote, the degree to which government agencies effectively had full access to everything that was going on Twitter blew my mind, Musk, who recently founded an artificial intelligence company, told Carlson in an interview set to air soon. Tucker Carlson then asked him, would that include people's DMs? And he said, yes. The Twitter boss promised to block this access as soon as he can. It is not clear if this applies to Gmail, nor has it been revealed if the Irish government has also been spying on Twitter or on Gmail users. Nobody will even ask them. Such is the supine nature of MSM journalism today. Sanctions going south. The West's mother of all sanctions against Russia has been described as the most monumental miscalculation in modern history. The sanctions have not brought the Russian economy to its knees, as was widely predicted. Instead, it's the Western economies that are reeling. Their economic growth has all but stopped. Many of them are simultaneously suffering from both high inflation and energy shortages. Russia, meanwhile, is not only surviving, but thriving, acquiring more potency and prestige throughout Asia, Africa, and South America than at any time since the collapse of the Soviet Union. According to the IMF, the Russian economy will grow faster than Germany's or the UK's this year. Next year, it will grow faster than those of the US, Japan, and Italy, and much of the West. Russia's unemployment rate at 3.5% is the lowest since the Soviet Union fell. Perhaps we might ask the West to sanction us as a way out of any economic difficulties we might have. Also, US anger at Macron-China moves. Emmanuel Macron has faced a storm of criticism from the hawks in the United States, as well as some EU members, after standing by his remarks that the bloc should be independent from Washington's militaristic foreign policy. The statement comes at a time that Macron is facing waves of strikes and protests at home over his deeply unpopular pension reforms, measures introduced after the eruption of the Ukraine war. The United States is now seeking to provoke China into a military conflict with Taiwan by sending weapons to Taipei and holding high-level talks with separatist forces in violation of the One China principle. The French leader initially said that the European Union should not be dragged into another crisis being initiated by the United States over Taiwan. He warned that Europe should end its policy of being, quote, caught up in crises that are not ours, unquote. Keep an eye on Macron. He will contact President Xi when he has a plan for peace in Ukraine. Remember, the Great China Belt and Road Initiative will go right through Ukraine on its way to the rest of us in Europe. There's been an interesting development after the dumping of secret documents in the United States. The FBI is reportedly investigating a former US Navy non-commissioned officer who was identified as a pro-Russian propagandist who allegedly played a key role in spreading intelligence documents uploaded online by suspected leaker Jack Teixeira. Sarah Bills, 37, a veteran who served at Whidbey Island in Washington state, was outed as, quote, Donbass Devushka, unquote, which translate to Donbass Girl, an online personality behind a vast network of pro-Kremlin blogs, podcasts, and fundraising accounts. While Bills touted herself online as a Ukrainian-born woman backing Russia's invasion and spreading misinformation against Kiev, she was actually born in New Jersey and now lives in Oak Harbor, Washington. Malcontent News first reported with information from the pro-Ukraine North Atlantic Fella Organization, also known as NAFO. Bills told the Wall Street Journal on Sunday that she is just an administrator for the Donbass Devushka persona, but noted there were about 14 others all over the world who run her vast network. The Journal reported on Monday that Bill's activities are being investigated by the feds, but the extent of the probe is unclear. The Telegram account linked to the persona had posted 4 of the allegedly leaked documents from the Department of Defense on April 5 that resulted in Teixeira's arrest last week. Bills claimed the documents were posted by another administrator. Donbass Devushka has dozens of administrators. Christopher Hitchens, the great English journalist, has reportedly made serious criticisms of Britain's involvement in the war. In the Daily Mail, in a reproach to silent parliamentarians, which also applies to Ireland, Peter Hitchens asked, quote, who decided to send the SAS to Ukraine? What are they doing there? What would happen if they were to be killed by Russian forces or captured by them? And what was a British surveillance plane capable of carrying 30 people doing over the Black Sea last September when a bungling Russian pilot almost shot it down, only failing because his missile was a dud? What would have happened if the missile had worked and many British servicemen and women had died? Nobody will answer these questions when I ask them. Once upon a time, we had a proper parliament in which brave, indomitable MPs, such as the late Tam Dalyell, would pursue such matters. Perhaps even now, some courageous man or woman is getting ready to step into Tam Dalyell's shoes. I do hope so. The same, I would say, might be said for the Dáil, with not a peep out of anyone because of the heavy propaganda mounted here. Note, for example, RTE News captions, all of which contain the blue and yellow colors of Ukraine still. Another war crime in Donetsk. A pregnant woman died outside a church she was leaving in Donetsk city on the Orthodox Easter Sunday, the latest in the daily war crimes committed in the city. Ukraine and our allies must take responsibility for these attacks, which are using Western-donated weapons and ammunition. Again, not a peep out of anyone in the West over targeting civilians. All roads lead to Donbass. Presidents Putin and Zelensky both made surprise visits to Donbass yesterday. Mr. Zelensky visited Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka, site of the daily bombings of Donetsk city, while Mr. Putin visits Zaporizhia and Kherson. And lastly, all monks at the Kiev Monastery in Kiev, at the center of a religious freedom row, are now facing the prospect of being forcefully evicted. The evictions are expected to be imminent, according to reports. Keep an eye on this, as there may be serious unrest there.
That was an excellent overview, John. And yet there's so much that we don't have time to cover linked to Ukraine and developments outside Ukraine and this new multipolar world, as they say, that's developing. Just in terms maybe to get stuck into all of that, in terms of this multipolar world and that release of documents that you and I maybe don't fully agree on the authenticity of the documents, or we're not sure about them. The South Korean government are very miffed at some of the information that came out about the US spying on their government. I personally believe that if you're in any government in the world, you should expect that you're being spied on. But this is a South Korean official making a public statement on the information that was leaked last week by allegedly by Jack Teixeira, this young Navy guy. He's only 21 years old. And we'll have a wee deeper talk about that in a minute. But we'll just have a look at this video of the South Korean representative, and then we'll come back to you.
미국 최고의 정보기관이 불법 스파이 활동을 우리나라와 같은 동맹국을 대상으로 자행해 온 것에 대해 깊은 유감을 표합니다. 명백한 진상 확인과 더불어 다시는 이런 일이 없도록 할 것을 강하게 촉구합니다.
So, John, that was the South Korean government representative making clear that they're not happy with US spying on them. And as well as that, they're saying that they're going to investigate these matters. What's your take on this?
Well, because it's such a controversial issue, and it may have unorthodox sources or may be used by the Americans. It may have been initiated by the Americans, who knows? But I'll say one thing. What South Korea has to say may be just an instruction from the Americans that they should say that to cover the United States. So we don't know. I mean, South Korea is dependent on the United States for its security. So it's not going to say no should Washington ask them to say something. But with this new development, with this Donbass-Dvushka line, which I don't buy into, there are so many administrators of each of those Telegram channels that it would be impossible to know which one was responsible for uploading the bits that they did upload. But bear in mind also that these documents were available for months before anyone noticed them at all. So a little bit of circulation just prior to them coming to the notice of everyone, it would have been the case.
When you look at the organizations that are allegedly linked to the so-called outing of Donbass to Vushka, they are like NAFO, the North American Fellows Association, a horrible organization of people who are, I won't say they're paid, but they're certainly very dedicated to shutting down any type of discussion or debate on the Ukraine issue that might in any way reflect a truthful, balanced debate. As well as that, in the last 24 hours, we've had 4 activists arrested in the United States for spreading Russian propaganda, essentially, against all free speech protections that exist in US law. These 4 people have been arrested. Have you come across that story today?
I didn't see that one today, no. That's a new one for me. But it doesn't surprise me at all. There have been arrests in Germany. There have been arrests elsewhere, you know, and it wouldn't at all surprise me if they continue with this. But it's an error and it's a mistake.
Yeah, it's a big shutdown, and it's just further totalitarianism. The United States is not supposed to be at war. So the idea that they're arresting people, they're alleging people are essentially spies, and treating them like spies because they exercise their free speech. And when you speak a point that is not completely supportive of the government narrative, then you're a Russian spy.
I'd be cautious about that whole American approach, because you have to bear in mind, for donkey's years, there was the Reds under the bed scare. And then we had, from 2014, we had all the nonsense about Trump being a Russian stooge and all the rest of it. They're complete and utter lies. But they know that if they tar anyone with a Russian brush, that they're considered to be awful people. And they continue to do that today. I don't see any reason why we should take part in that prejudicial approach.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. Is CNN going to be the next to be arrested? Because unusually for CNN, they seem to have reflected some truth about what's happening in the Ukraine-Russia NATO conflict. And what I mean by that is that an ICC warrant, International Criminal Court warrant, was issued for the arrest of Vladimir Putin and the children's ombudsman in Russia, alleging that they kidnapped many children and forced them to go to Russia and to these what they often described as retraining camps. There were actually children whose parents sent them to Russia to be safe, and they went to cultural camps, fun camps, places to learn musical instruments, all that kind of stuff. But this news doesn't get in, the fact that this isn't true doesn't usually get into the mainstream or the corporate media headlines. But CNN have broken the ice a little bit by doing so. We're going to have a look at a video now that CNN put out, or a clip of a video, in which they make the people being interviewed make clear they're in Russia because they want to be in Russia. Let's have a look.
Yeah.
New arrivals quickly had their Ukrainian passports swapped for Russian ones. Natalia figures she can't go back.
Because we are criminals there. Because those who left for Russia are immediately considered criminals by the Ukrainian authorities. So I'm forbidden to go there.
At this point, the absence of clarity is the biggest problem. There is understandably within Ukraine a absolute outrage against those who are perceived as collaborators. But the fact of the matter is that we are dealing here with a civilian population that was seeking refuge in a time of war.
Under the terms of Russia's relocation program, the Ukrainians are required to stay for at least 3 years. One woman, Marina, told CNN that after that, we will see. It depends on the job and material well-being. So far, it's not very easy. Another, Valeria, said plainly that her family will stay in Russia, and I don't even want to think about Ukraine. Russia says more than 5 million Ukrainians have arrived in Russia since the full-scale war began. And while Ukraine says many were forcibly deported, some, like Oksana, said they went willingly.
We were saving our own lives,
though they had few other options.
Now, it is unclear just how freely people felt that they could speak to us, but some were very obviously on the side of Russia. One woman told us that she wants to go back to Mariupol one day to visit, but hopes that by then it is firmly part of Russia. Others had more mixed opinions or simply didn't want to answer questions about the war. We did also reach out to Russia's Ministry of Internal Affairs, but we didn't get a response to any of our questions.
What do you think about that, John, that CNN actually put out a clip like that?
Well, that's wonderful to see, I have to say now, Finbar, because I've been waiting for quite a while for mainstream media to fear that no one will ever believe them again if they continue with their position on Ukraine and supporting and following everything Zelensky does, because it's a dangerous path to be on, and it'll lead us to bad places.
Even but when I see CNN, I always have to ask myself, is there another angle here? Is there another reason why in this little glimmer they're giving a little bit of truth? Maybe it's so that when the whole war narrative collapses and Russia is successful in its expectations from this war, and it looks like the United States in particular and NATO had a major failing here. At that stage, maybe CNN, when the truth starts coming out en masse, CNN can point back and say, well, listen, we did actually say that. We did make that point. So maybe that's what they're doing. Last week, every week we've showed video footage of these Ukrainian conscription teams that go around the country just grabbing anybody and everybody, as long as they're not wealthy, of course, are important, but grabbing anybody and everybody and sending them off to the front line in Ukraine to almost certain death, because we know now that there's over 250,000, mainly men, have died on the Ukrainian side fighting. So they're sending these people out there. But last week, for the first time, we showed a video where one of these conscription teams was successfully resisted by a group of women who protected young men who they were trying to conscript and send to the front line. We have another video this week. I'm not sure when it's from, but it shows one of these guys from these conscription teams trying to nab somebody. He nabbed the wrong guy. Let's have a look at this. It looks like he tried to nab Bruce Lee or something like that. Have you seen that video, John?
Yeah, he got a bit of a shock there, I think. It's not a good idea to try and pick up a cage fighter on your own, and he certainly suffered for it.
Yeah. At the beginning of this war, just on the issue of a cage fighter, there was a cage fighter, a famous cage fighter, who was arrested by Ukraine's SBU, which is like their Gestapo essentially, were arrested by Ukraine's SBU. And images and video footage came out of him being tortured, and apparently he's dead at the moment. So just while you said, just mention a cage fighter there, it's interesting that one of these, or a military or intelligence unit, did grab a cage fighter, an internationally famous cage fighter, who was tortured, videoed being tortured and murdered. I'm not sure if you recall that case, do you, John?
I don't recall that case. Maybe he made the mistake of hitting them and there was too many of them. You know,
I actually think the problem was that he was a Russian speaker and cultured Russian, and he wasn't overtly giving his allegiance to the Zelensky regime, and I think that was the problem. It was around
there's always that problem. You know, people think that it's only a Donbass issue, the Russian-speaking story. It's only a Donbass issue. It's not. It's all over Ukraine, and in fact, the Russian speakers will tell you that they are disproportionately being picked to fight for the Ukrainian side. Now, if you're a Russian speaker and you're fighting for the side who disrespect your language, don't want it spoken, who disrespect your culture, hate it, and you have to fight and die for them, what a terrible situation to be in.
Yeah, and I know that there's a lot of people just automatically, there were reports coming out that there's a lot of those that have been conscripted, and as soon as they get to the front line, they run over to the other side. They take out the white piece of cloth and they go over to the other side, because I think the penny is starting to drop as soldiers are sent home, that they're not being tortured by the Russians, that they're being treated well. And as that news circulates, a lot more are willing to surrender rather than being killed aimlessly for a war that they don't want.
Well, you did see the images of the 4 chaps who were surrendering, and they were shot by their own side, by the Ukrainian side. I mean, that's the function of the Kraken battalion, who are again neo-Nazi and will do anything. So they're put behind the front line in case anyone tries to leave, and they can be taken away and shot, or taken away and imprisoned.
And isn't this kind of I've said from the very beginning that when I look at the actions of Ukraine's military and many of their politicians, or the regime as I call it, I've noticed that they almost seem to be willing themselves to repeat what happened in Germany in 1944 and 1945, to the point of their treatment of their own side, the extremely harsh attitude to their own people and to their own soldiers, and they're executing people who won't fight. They're putting the fear of God into people, sending children and old men to fight. And it's all so reflective of what happened in January, February, March, and April of 1945.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. You know, they are particularly vicious. And when they get a Russian, they're particularly vicious. They have this hatred that they learn in school, from their family. In certain areas in particular, the far west of the country, around Lviv and Iverno-Franco, and around that particular neighborhood.
But, you mentioned that Zelensky went to Artemovsk, I think. Not Artemovsk.
He went to Avdiivka.
Avdiivka, yes. That's actually surrounded at the moment, or almost surrounded at the moment, by the Russians. And the day before, Putin had visited the front line and did a tour and met people and things, not necessarily right on the front line, but near enough the front line. I noticed that whenever Putin does go to visit the troops, the next day Zelensky's out visiting the troops. But I'm not sure, first of all, if Zelensky really was in Avdiivka itself. But this notion of going to places that are about to fall and pinning medals on people, again, it just reminds me of those images of Adolf Hitler in the rubble of Berlin, pinning medals on young boys and expecting them to go out and fight and die when all was lost. Do these comparisons ever come to your mind?
I would have thought that Avdiivka was the last place that Zelensky should be visiting, because it is the main source of the war crimes that occur every day in Donetsk city. That's where they're firing from. And that's why it is a particularly bloody battle.
Well, we saw, didn't we, that they bombed on Easter Sunday. They actually bombed a monastery square up where lots of people would be praying and things like that. And it was from that area, I believe, the missiles came, that Zelensky visited. And isn't it just reflective of a spite and a maliciousness that has no other purpose other than its own spite and maliciousness, to hurt other people for no reason whatsoever?
But the only reason that he can do that is because nobody is saying anything over on this side. Nobody in mainstream media are saying every day there are war crimes in Donetsk city and its environs. They're not saying that. Civilians are being targeted every day. And people are keeping quiet about it. Pregnant woman coming out from Mass Easter Sunday. I mean, where does it end?
Where did it begin? And from the point of view of who was involved. Last week we showed historical footage of Lindsey Graham meeting those more extremist elements in the Ukraine military in the Donbass region in 2014-15. We have video here just to link the story of Joe Biden. Now, he's been in this from the start as well. Maybe from a military advocacy point of view, not so much as Lindsey Graham and McCain. But from the point of view of dirty dealings, from the point of view of political intrigue, from the point of view of familial nepotism with regards to big money and big jobs connected to politics and family, Biden has been in there from the start. We've got a bit of video footage here just to prove that to you guys, in case there's any doubt. A bit of video footage here from Biden on stage boasting about how he had the Attorney General, essentially, or the main prosecutor in Ukraine, fired because the prosecutor was going to investigate a company called Burisma that Biden essentially had his son put in charge of in Ukraine. And Burisma was an energy company. Biden's son had no skills, or what was he doing on the board of an energy company? And it was all dirt. And this is what Donald Trump was talking about when he was raising up Biden's dirty business in Ukraine. But here's Biden boasting about having the chief prosecutor fired because he was going to investigate essentially his son's involvement in Burisma and Biden's involvement. We'll have a look at this. We'll come back in a minute.
It just happened to be that was the assignment I got. I got all the good ones, so I got Ukraine, and I remember going over convincing our team, or others, to convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kiev, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to the press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
John, it's a historical video, but it never seems to amaze me, the brazenness of people like Biden, that they'll stand up on a stage and they'll boast about that type of interference. And then a few years later, they'll go around like angels as if they were completely innocent and this war has nothing to do with America or politics or anything like that. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a perfect example of why we need this multipolar world that is coming our way. So that we don't have a plenipotentiary visiting one of his regions where he does what he likes. And that's what they did in Ukraine. I mean, that guy that they sacked, people had looked for him for a long time, because it's very hard to get somebody who isn't bent in Ukraine. And that's well known. And it's true today as it was in the past. So that's the issue there.
Yeah. And so the corruption for Ukraine has always been known as a corrupt country. But we see now that the president of the United States and his family were right deep in the middle of it, as they still are today.
But can you imagine doing your best, being that chap, putting your neck on the line to do the right thing, and assuming that the American president would be pleased that you're a straight guy? But no.
I wonder where he is now. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that he's died before his time, if you want to put it like that.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised, because people tend to forget. I mean, at the start of this, there were peace talks going on in Minsk. And at one stage, the Ukrainian team came back to Kiev, and the SBU murdered one of the delegates because he had been he lacked hatred for the Russians, perhaps. But they murdered him.
Wasn't hateful enough, as they say. Just while we're looking at some historical things, an incident that occurred, or a proclamation that occurred from Ukrainian authorities over the last year, has been that Russian forces have systemically used sexual assault, rape, pedophilia even, to intimidate the Ukrainian population into submission. And these reports primarily came from the so-called Human Rights Commissioner of Ukraine. Her name is Lyubina Dennisova. Since she brought out these allegations, which were very, very detailed allegations of sexual abuse on children, on women, just horrific stuff on males, male-on-male abuse, all of these things, and in great graphic detail. But it was discovered because international organizations came over to Ukraine to actually give help and offer treatment to these so-called many victims, according to Dennisova. But when they arrived, they found out that there were no victims. And from there, people started to investigate. And even Ukraine's own media started to highlight the severe, extreme propaganda and the sexually graphic propaganda that Dennisova was spreading. So from that, these allegations went right around the world and are still being echoed and repeated in arguments in relation to Russia and Russia's modus operandi in fighting this war. To the extent that even the Irish principal public broadcaster, RTE, in one of its main news stories, lambasted the Russian ambassador on this issue and highly and wholly insulted him and treated him with such disrespect. And I don't think they've ever apologized. I don't think they've ever corrected themselves. Denisova was fired by Ukraine's own parliament when this became an international scandal. And I just have a headline here, just that covers that, from a Scottish newspaper. And also I have the text of that. So we'll just go through that as well. Just bear with me a moment. So here's the headline. She was fired over handling of Russian sexual assault claims. So this is Lyubina Denisova, a glitzy looking lady. She said that she got a lot of her graphic details from her daughter, who was a counsellor. So this story focused on a letter from many journalists and academics in Ukraine over the last year who were disgusted by what Denisova had done. So the letter from the journalists indicated how reports from Denisova went into great detail about the alleged rape of children, some as young as 6 months old, by Russians. The letter also criticized Denisova for including details of cases that the journalists said were unverified and asked her to check the facts before publication and disclose only information for which there is sufficient evidence. The letter went on to say that the information put out by Denisova's office is regarded as factual by the media and is then used in articles and in speeches by public figures. According to the online Ukrainian news platform, so this is a report on an article from a popular Ukrainian newspaper. According to the online Ukrainian news platform, one member of the Ukrainian parliament, Pavlo Frolov, provided a number of reasons why Denisova was removed, including the numerous details of unnatural sexual offences and child sexual abuses in the occupied territories, which were unsupported by evidence and only harmed Ukraine. He also stated that other reasons for her removal from her post included repeated failure to perform her duties related to the establishment of humanitarian corridors, as well as counteracting the deportation of adults and children from the occupied territories. Yuranska Pravda also reported that more than 230 of the 450 members of the legislative body voted in favour of removing Denisova. It's unclear who will take over the post at this time. So I have to say, I have looked into this story before, and the reporting there is being very mild-mannered in how they're talking about this, because the detail that woman went into and the absolute fabrications and lies that she made up to smear everybody in the Russian army, and indeed the Russian people themselves, over something that was totally fabricated, and was just when you think of the victimhood of babies being sexually abused, and she decided to use things like that, make up stories, just to propaganda-wise benefit her side. It just seems terrible. You came across that at the time, John. What do you think?
Yeah, at that stage in the conflict, the Ukrainian side were relying very heavily on propaganda because militarily they weren't cutting it. So they relied very heavily on propaganda. I mean, Denisova's reports were just horrendous. And I was so disgusted when I saw on the 6 o'clock news, the Russian ambassador, the representative of the people of Russia, being savagely attacked. Something that should never happen to any ambassador. I mean, we've had British ambassadors here who've bombed this city, and we don't treat them in that way. And this was a lie. And I would add further, it's more than a lie. It's what the Jews would call a blood libel. And it's no surprise that it should come from that part of the world against the Russians. But an absolute lie. And another one, for example, I'll give you is the Zelensky's wife, when she claimed on television that the Russian soldiers' wives were telling them to rape Ukrainian women. Now, that's just simply not believable. But because nobody criticizes, questions, takes somebody up on anything they say, they can say anything they like.
At one point, I think Zelensky's wife, in all sincerity, said that somebody had taken down a jet or something like that, with a tin of beans or something like that.
That's right, she did, yeah. A woman. She was given the story of this plucky lady, older lady, who threw a glass of gherkins or something at a missile and took it down. Not absolute nonsense, of course.
It's absolutely ludicrous stuff.
But at some stage, I'm hoping that, you know, journalists will ask questions when the Ukrainians tell them things. They will ask them questions. They will check it out. They are not saints. Are they not all sinners? They're only humans like ourselves, but they should be treated like the way we treat each other and ask the hard questions.
Yeah. In Ireland, the Green Party is proving itself to be a pro-war party, similar in Germany and other countries as well, to the point that I'm starting to conclude that in Europe, at least, the Green Party has been captured by intelligence agencies like the CIA, maybe MI6, MI5, things like that. Here we have a video of a Green Party Member of Parliament in Ireland, or TD as we call them here. And he is talking about how Ireland, he believes, wants to abandon neutrality and wants to go to war with Russia, essentially, is what he's saying. Irrespective of the fact that constantly polls in Ireland have shown that Ireland doesn't want to be a part of NATO and Ireland wants to retain its neutrality. This guy has decided to get up in Parliament and say quite the opposite. We'll have a look at that video and we'll come back in a minute.
I think it does behove questions in this country about our own position. Can we support the European Union's military response? And countries of the military of the European Union are taking a very strong stance against the war in Ukraine. But of course, we as a country have to ask ourselves, what part do we play? Do we continue to be the trusted third-party arbiter? And we have done very well over the decades in that position. But we can't be neutral in the face of these atrocities that are happening in Ukraine. And we have to figure out how we respond and how we have a genuine and authentic debate. I probably disagree with Paul Murphy on a lot, particularly with relation to this issue, but the debate is a welcome one and we do have to address it. And I think the Irish people don't want to be neutral. I don't know what the difference between politically neutral and military neutral is in any case. I think it is right that we are responding to the way that we are, but as a union, it is right that we stand up to Russian tyranny, because if we merely condemn the tyranny in Ukraine, then we're going to see Ukraine overrun, and then Moldova, and then Georgia, and then Poland, and then the Baltic countries. That is the reality of it. And I don't believe anybody in this House wants that to happen.
So that was Green Party TD Brian Ledden talking about how he believes that the Irish people want to go to war, essentially. But they're coming from the Green Party. And when you consider that the military-industrial complex and the military itself are some of the biggest polluters in the world, there's no end to the shameful hypocrisy, is there, John?
No, there's not. I mean, you had Annalena Baerbock, the German Green, who's the Minister for Defense of Germany, saying that we are at war with Russia. She wants that to be the case. They're crazy people. I mean, for example, over here, nothing would surprise me that they're a mosquito party over here. So they only get a handful of individuals who are interested in that sort of thing. But I'd be more upset if anyone from a serious party said it.
Yeah, yeah. But they are in government.
Well, they're in power, but they're not in government.
Yeah.
Or they're in government, but they're not in power, I should say.
Yeah, yeah. They seem to be just lapdogging as usual, as far as I can see. John, earlier on, you were talking about the failure of Russian sanctions, and one of the clear and identifiable results of that is the creation of this multipolar world, is China and Russia coming together, but it's also all of the other economies in the world outside of the Euro-US centric sphere. All of those other countries coming together to abandon the petrodollar, and a lot of visits to China. We have a video here, we'll just show it for a few seconds, of the visit by Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, as he visited Beijing this week. We'll have a look at that video, we'll come back in a wee second. There's Brazil's Lula da Silva. Whilst he was in China, and when he came back from China, he's made some very, very strong statements about the multipolar world, but also about the fact that the United States is not going to dictate policy to Brazil, to China, or to anyone else anymore. What do you make on that visit to China, John?
Well, as I was saying last week, all roads lead to China now. Ever since March the 10th, Friday, March the 10th, when there was a peace agreement between the Sunni Muslim Saudi Arabia and the Shia Muslim Iran. The wars between Sunnis and Shias have been going on over the Middle East this past 20 to 30 years and longer. And it's a particularly vicious war. And now China has made it possible for them to see their future together. They see their future together because it's obvious to anyone with a nose on them that the future is not going to be unipolar American. Nobody wants that now. And there's another issue. The Europeans are on a particularly sticky wicket, and Ireland is on the stickiest of all wickets on this one. You know, European countries have been the colonial masters around the world. They will be hated wherever they went. And if we are seen as one of the colonials, it would be ridiculous. It's a suit we should never wear. We were colonized for 800 years, which is the very reason why we have such a resistance to any violence or war or anything of that nature. We've had it for way too long. I think we have a physical aversion to that. We've had it for so long. And anyone who tries to force us into a war, I think will pay a price politically.
That is what's happening. Like, we've had a corporate media that seems determined on bringing us to war. We have governing parties that seem the same. We even have the bloody Green Party that seems to be the same. So we had Lula going to Beijing to talk business, to talk relationships and building connections. At the same time, we have the US this week sending a further 200 military training personnel to Taiwan to stoke further trouble with China. It seems that there are elements within the Pentagon and the deep state in the United States that are absolutely convinced that they are right in creating war with China.
Well, they just want to be numero uno. That's what they want. Mr. Nice Guy comes last in American society. You know, anyone over 30 on a bus is a loser. It's that kind of a place. But it's collapsing. It has reached its zenith and it's falling from it. And I just wish the serious people in the United States, not the Newlands, not the Blinkens, none of those people that are in the State Department and have been causing trouble this past 20 odd years, they need to go. And I just hope that the adult American polity will come to that conclusion too.
EU Commissioner von der Leyen, or von der Leyen, I like to call her von der Leyen, and Rubio in the United States, Marco Rubio, are not happy. And this is again reflective of the outcomes of the sanctions, the outcomes of the multipolar world that's developing, are not happy at all. You mentioned earlier with Macron and his utterances over the last week since returning from China that France cannot be a vassal of the United States when it comes to the French-China policy. And we have a video here of Rubio's reaction to Macron's comments. We'll come back in a wee minute.
I think this is a good moment for us to ask Europe, does Macron speak for all of Europe? Is Macron now the head of Europe? Is he now the most powerful leader in Europe? Because if he is, then there's some things we're going to need to change. Number one, Europe, including France specifically, has depended heavily on the United States for 70 years for their own defense. In fact, when Macron tried to play global superpower and send troops to North Africa to fight terrorists, he couldn't even get his own troops there. We had to fly them there, and we had to fly them back. He couldn't even get his own troops there. So if they're going to break off on their own and follow Macron's lead, that's going to save us a lot of money. As far as not getting involved in other conflicts that are not ours, we need to ask Europe, does he speak for them? Because we're pretty heavily involved in Ukraine right now. We're spending a lot of our taxpayer money on a European war. And I've supported that because I think it's in the national interest of the United States to be allies to our allies. But if our allies' position, if in fact Macron speaks for all of Europe and their position now is they're not going to pick sides between the US and China over Taiwan, then maybe we shouldn't be picking sides either. Maybe we should basically say we're going to focus on Taiwan and the threats that China poses, and you guys handle Ukraine and Europe.
It looks like there's been about 50 spanners thrown into the works over the last few weeks, John. What's your take on the Marco Rubio attack on Macron's approach?
Well, I mean, anyone who looks at it will be very affronted as a European. They seem to think that Europe cannot live without them. They seem to think that we require Raytheon and all their bombs and all their weapons to survive. We don't. We need good diplomats, people who can see trouble a mile off and can head it off at the pass. They're the kind of people we need, serious people. And we're not getting it at the moment, unfortunately.
I'm just increasingly surprised that the United States, its own inventories of weaponry are nearly gone. Any excess stock they had is certainly gone. The same in Europe. Now, there's orders put in by Raytheon, but sure, when will that all be made? Australia seems to be the apparatus of choice for the United States to spark war with Taiwan. But it appears that all the indicators are that they can't win this. They can't win a dual contentious war with Russia, even if they are by proxy, and with China. And yet these elements, including the likes of Marco Rubio, when it comes to China, he may not be so hot on Ukraine, but certainly on China, the likes of him, what's behind it for them? Because they just can't win. Are they actually dunces? Or is there some other thing that we can't see going on?
There is something else that we can't see that is going on, and that is that America is run by and large for the benefit of its corporate shareholders and not for the voters, the electorate. That's where the problem lies. So if Raytheon shareholders are happy, then you don't need anything else. The thinking that will be required, by a normal polity to decide what their defense arm might want or not, it's completely skewed here, where it's the defense industries who are pushing them towards war. And they are calling up their various spear carriers, like Lindsey Graham, to give a big, scary story to the American people and tell them what they're going to do heroically and all the rest of it, and tell them how bad the other side is. all that stuff, which is very easy. But the world isn't happy with that anymore. It's not having it. And all roads lead to China.
Yeah, it's all very
The
interesting.
interesting thing will be, though, will the Europeans have enough bottle to say to the Americans, look, we're going it alone now. We don't need you anymore, because that's what we need to do. We can be friends.
I'm not sure what we get from our relationship with the United States from the point of view of production, of economy, of things like that. And it's clear that a lot of this is about economics. It's about tearing Europe away from the Russian economy and the Russian supply of good deals in relation to not just energy, but grain and other things like that. John, we're just running out of time. In terms of what to look out for over the next week, what would you advise people to keep an eye out for?
But I'd keep an eye on the Kiev Monastery, because they're going to eject the monks physically, and that is imminent. It could happen any moment. So that is something I would watch out for. And I'd always keep an eye on the Beijing thing, because that's where the action is these days. It's in Beijing.
And as we showed a percentages map of control of Backmode earlier, it looks around 10% still. But the northwest seems to be completely taken by the Russians over the last 24 hours. As you said earlier, they're using much larger scale
But
bombs.
these are, as I say, the game changer. Because as you see in Backmode, when a large group of soldiers are going into a smaller and smaller area, their vulnerability is something shocking. To a 1,500 kilogram bomb. Nothing can survive that.
I saw some figures coming out yesterday, and just in Bakhmut alone, there was at least 300 Ukrainian troops killed, and that's just in one day. On Easter Day, even though there was essentially a ceasefire, the Russians weren't taking any offensives, they were just defensive actions. There was still 130 something killed in Bakhmut that day. And right along the lines, you know, you'll watch things like Military Summary, which gives an analysis of figures of casualties. And right along the lines, it's 100 here, 20 here, 50 here, 100, 200 here. And it all adds up to all these living souls, all these sons dying, and fathers and brothers dying for what? John, thanks for joining us this week. If you're watching this, folks, give it a like, give us a subscribe if you're on a platform that does subscriptions and things like that. It doesn't cost you any money. It'll keep us linked in, and it'll keep this news coming out, and it'll raise it up in the ratings, as they say. In the meantime, have a safe week. Join myself and John again next week. Thanks for calling me here, John.
Thank you, Finbar.